Page 108. Right from the unconscious state compared to the divine sound sleep state, until full and complete consciousness is gained in the man state, compared to the wide open eyes of man experiencing the gross world, God remains one, indivisible, infinite, formless, and eternally all-pervading. But it is the all-pervading, infinite nature of God that expresses consciously and unconsciously His eternal divine existence, directly and indirectly, in one and all states and forms, through their expressions of their very being. The whole process of evolution was an absolutely spontaneous outcome of the original infinite whim, surging in the unconscious God to become conscious of His eternal and infinite existence. And paradoxical as it may seem, in the process of evolution, the unconsciousness of God urged the gradual unfoldment of the latent consciousness of God, which consciousness grew greater and greater through a gradual, systematic, and progressive process of gathering and experiencing varied and innumerable impressions, through identifying God with varied and innumerable gross forms. So it is that the evolving consciousness of God gives rise to the identification of God with forms and states of forms of higher and higher types. This identification of God, in turn, gives rise to an apparently unending chain of associations and dissociations, or the so-called births and deaths, of forms and beings which continue to form and assert and then dwindle away in the nothingness, leaving behind the legacy of impressions, which in turn again lead the evolving consciousness of God to identify Himself with yet another form, molded of the very impressions left behind by the form that dwindled away. Through the process of evolution, the unconscious God did eventually gain full consciousness, when the evolved consciousness of God eventually identified God with the human form. But this full consciousness gained was impressioned consciousness, and therefore did not make God realize the original infinite state of God. On the contrary, God realized that He is man. Thus God, after having the original whim of His first word, parentheses, who am I, close parentheses, at this stage finds himself to be man and experiences the gross world, apparently living in it as man and quite oblivious of his infinite and eternal existence, until he finds the real answer to his first word of, quote, "Who am I?" close quote, to be, quote, "I am God," close quote. So it is that the original whim created the nothing, and the impressions, or the sanskaras, preserved that nothing as the nothingness. I.e., the creation and the creatures of creation. And eventually, the opposite impressions will ultimately uproot these impressions and destroy that nothingness to give realization of reality. It was the original whim of God that affected, in the absolutely independent God, the infinite triune attributes of God the Creator, God the Preserver, God the Destroyer, parentheses, i.e. Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, close parentheses. It is God's original whim itself that is responsible for bestowing upon God infinite attributes such as the Creator, the Preserver, the Destroyer. These infinite triune attributes of God consistently force assertion through consistent formation, conservation, and dissolution of all things and beings in existence. Even in the everyday life of man and of all creatures in creation, this infinite triune aspect of God consistently appears to assert through consistent births, procreations, parentheses, maintaining the preservation, closed parentheses, and deaths. The original first word, through the original whim of God, created out of the latent nothing, the latent, original first impression of, quote, "Who am I?" close quote. And this original first impression procreated the latent nothingness as the original creation. In turn, the procreation of the nothingness procreates the impressions which continue to preserve the nothingness, consistently as the original creation, until eventually this nothingness is destroyed by opposite impressions through the processes of reincarnation and involution of consciousness. And the final answer of, quote, "I am God," close quote, is obtained to the first word, quote, "Who am I?" close quote. It is in accordance with the procreated impressions of the varied, individualized, conscious assertions of inanimate and animate forms and beings that illusion consistently maintains its apparently infinite and varied stand. It is because of this unfailing and apparently unending chain of varied, individualized, procreated impressions that the original creation, originating out of the original whim of God, is consistently preserved, while being concurrently evolved, so that every individualized form and being in existence may consciously experience the answers to the first word, quote, "Who am I?" close quote, as, quote, "I am an inanimate thing," close quote. Quote, "I am an animate creature," close quote. Quote, "I am a rational being," close quote. Quote, "I am a man," close quote, and, quote, "I am a woman," close quote. For example, when God in the man state, as man, is in sound sleep, and when time and space, as the day and the universe of the man have all been apparently destroyed for him, then what is it that every day unfailingly creates his daily morning for him? And again, when man wakes up every day, then what is it that unfailingly creates for him his universe and all the things that are of it and in it? It is the man's own dormant impressions, gathered during the course of the evolution of consciousness and during the process of reincarnation, that incite his own dormant consciousness during sound sleep to wake him up inadvertently every day, so that the man's own dormant impressions may have the necessary scope to become exhausted through conscious experiences during his awake state. In this manner, the man's own impressions in the dormant state create for the man his own morning and his own universe every day. Although both the daily morning and the universe of the man were simultaneously created for him by his own dormant impressions, yet both were already handily preserved for him by his own impressions of his life in the everyday awake state, and also through the procreation in his own everyday life of deeper and deeper impressions, or sanskaras, of the already existing illusion, or of the original creation, which sprang from the original whim of God. Eventually, both the morning, parentheses, or the day, close parentheses, and the universe of that man are destroyed by the man's own opposite impressions, experienced in his sleep state, which are diametrically opposite to the impressions of his awake state. Hence, in regular unfailing succession, God in the man state as man consistently asserts himself as the creator of his own creation through the dormant impressions of man, as the preserver of his own creation through man's leading the everyday life in the awake state, procreating the impressions of creation, and as the destroyer of his own creation through the opposite impressions of man when he falls asleep and ultimately passes away in the sound sleep state. Every day, finally destroying the very creation as individualized by his consciousness, man once again creates, preserves, and destroys the whole creation through the play of impressions. Even through the very being of everything and of every creature, God consistently asserts his infinite triune attributes as the creator, the preserver, and the destroyer. As in the nature of the man state, so also in the nature of every state of God. God consistently asserts directly and indirectly, apparently and really, his infinite triune attributes of creator, preserver, and destroyer at one and the same time. Even in the very pulsation of the heart and in the functioning of the lungs, the three aspects of the infinite triune attributes never fail to assert. With every pulsation of the heart expands, relaxes, parentheses in the refractory period, close parentheses, and contracts, simultaneously heralding the advent of the birth of a being on the one hand, and sustaining the life of the being on the other hand, and finally with the eventual and final contraction leading to the physical death of the being. Thus it is that the triune attributes of God, as God the Creator, God the Preserver, and God the Destroyer, parentheses, Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh, or Shiva, assert independently as well as simultaneously in all things and in every creature and in all beings, in every state of God, at every stage in the evolution of consciousness, and on every plane in the involution of consciousness, until eventually the original cosmic creation, having sustained the ages, cycles, and periods, and being preserved by the play of cosmic impressions, is finally destroyed by the play of cosmic opposite impressions of God. This final destruction is generally known as Mahapralaya, meaning the, quote, greatest of the great event of absorption, close quote, when the whole cosmic creation as nothingness is absorbed infinitely by the everything. In the process of evolution, unconscious God did obtain full consciousness, not of his original infinite state, but of the gross and finite. After all the struggle during the course of evolution, which achieved full consciousness for God, no doubt, at what price was it gained? The cost was the burden of the legacy of impressions accumulated in the gross form, the last medium of association of the evolving consciousness of God, through which full consciousness was completely evolved in the instant that God identified himself with the human form. Therefore God, in the man state, is still unaware of his original state, despite having gained full consciousness. This unawareness is due to the unwanted, though necessary, burden of the gross impressions still clinging to the full consciousness gained. The process through which God, in the man state, struggled to unburden these finite impressions is one which takes place through opposite impressions and is called the process of reincarnation. In trying to unburden consciousness from the finite impressions, the gross consciousness of God necessarily has to experience these impressions and then exhaust them by innumerable opposite experiences through a series of reincarnations. Experiences opposite by nature are absolutely essential to exhaust the impressions, because opposite experiences alone can shake up the roots of thickly set or firmly established varied impressions. In the process of reincarnation, the fully gross conscious God in man, fortified with fully developed subtle and mental bodies, which are consistently, though unconsciously used, must necessarily experience a series of unending chains of varied and innumerable experiences, opposite by nature, in order that the impressions of opposites might be exhausted. These impressions are constantly being imprinted upon or picked up by the mental body or the mind of man, and are retained or released by the subconsciousness in man. When these impressions are released through the subconsciousness and full consciousness of God in man, as man, he has varied experiences according to the variety and the intensity of the impressions released. Whereas the subtle body of man, which is the seat of energy, energizes the impressions to activate man into committing actions in his everyday life of either the dream or awake state, parentheses, as the case may be, close parentheses. These actions are also opposite in nature to the varied, related opposite impressions. Thus, in the man state on the gross plane, although energy and the mind are fully developed and are continually and consistently used, yet they are employed indirectly and unconsciously. When on the planes of energy, parentheses, i.e. on the subtle planes, close parentheses, this energy is divinely and consciously made use of. But on the subtle planes, the mind is made use of indirectly and unconsciously. On the mental planes, when this mind is made use of divinely and consciously, energy is only made use of indirectly and unconsciously. Asterisk, See also Meher Baba, quote, control of mind over energy and matter, close quote. Life at its best. Edited IVO Deuce. San Francisco, Sufism Reoriented, Inc., 1957. 38, ed. It necessarily follows that while this gross conscious God in the man state experiences the opposites in the gross world, he reincarnates a number of times, sometimes as a male, sometimes as a female, in the varied castes, creeds, nationalities, and colors, and in varied different places and continents, always reviewing opposite impressions and exhausting them by experiences of opposites. It is always through these diverse oppositional impressions and their respective opposed experiences that gross conscious God in the man state on earth can possibly one day, after millions of rebirths, thin out the thick-set impressions. It is the process of this cycle of so-called deaths and births of human forms that ultimately urges the consciousness of the gross conscious God in the man state to involve. This process of involution of consciousness gradually takes place when the gross impressions gradually grow fainter and scarcer. Involution of the consciousness of God in the man state is only possible when the opposite impressions, after a very, very long process, gradually thin out through the process of unfailing reincarnations, which leads to the limit of gross impressions. When the limit of gross impressions is reached, then the stage is attained where gross conscious God in the man state gradually becomes dissociated from the gross world as the involution of consciousness begins to enfold the consciousness. Simultaneously with the beginning of the involution of consciousness, God in the man state gradually dissociates from experiencing the impressions of the opposites of the gross world. It was seen that God attained full consciousness through the process of evolution of consciousness. But the full consciousness gained was a consciousness that was impressioned. In order to wipe the impressions off of the full consciousness gained, the process of reincarnation and the process of involution of consciousness must be followed through. The process of the evolution of consciousness of God was compared to the gradual opening of the eyes of man. When man opened his eyes completely, it was compared with the end of the evolution of consciousness, because God then had gained full consciousness. The process of the reincarnation of God in the man state may be compared with the man completely awake, with full consciousness and with eyes wide open, gaining diverse experiences opposite to the impressions he gathered during the years of his life, and which he now actively experiences during the course of his days. Forgetting his own self amid the execution of his multifarious activities. Now the urge for the involution of the consciousness of God in the man state may be compared with the man who, having been engrossed in his activities of the day, at last finds time, when the day's work is practically over, to pay attention to his own self rather than to his activities. Thus urged, man's attention shifts automatically from external activities towards paying proper attention to his own self. Just as full consciousness was evolved in 7 different stages, so too, evolved full consciousness is completely involved through the process of involution in 7 different stages. These 7 stages of involution of consciousness are named, quote, the 7 planes of consciousness, close quote. The 7th plane is the 7th and last stage in the process of an involution of consciousness, where consciousness is completely involved and God consciously realizes his eternal, infinite existence. That is, God, who was originally unconscious, now becomes oblivious of oblivion itself. These 7 stages of gradual involution of the consciousness of God in the man state may be compared with the wide open eyes of a man, at first gazing straight ahead of him and away from him. Then, in an attempt to behold his own self, he lowers his eyes gradually, shifting them in 7 stages until eventually his range of vision includes his own self. On the opposite page, there's a chart number 4 titled Evolution and Involution. At the top we have Parabrahma, then Paramatma, and on the left going down, parentheses, unconscious Atma, close, and reality, and then a dividing line, and we have we have the evolution of consciousness, first stage, stones and metals, vegetation, worms, fishes, birds, animals, man, consciousness complete, no higher forms. And then going up to the right on this chart, 7th stage, well, at the bottom we have reincarnations, no more evolution of form. Then going up, we have 7th stage, we have Jivatma, fully conscious, and we have the involution of consciousness, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th plane. And then the dividing line, and we have 7th plane, man-God merged in Paramatma, Shivatma, full consciousness, matured. And we're back up to Paramatma with Paratpar Parabrahma on top. So stones and metals through man, and then 7th stage, or the Jivatma, fully conscious, 1st through 6th planes, is marked all illusion. And reality is the Paratpar Parabrahma, Paramatma, and unconscious Atma, Shivatma, man-God, merged in Paramatma. Paragraph at the bottom of the chart. Just as the fully evolved consciousness of man in the 7th stage considers the stone consciousness as the most crude, so also the fully involved consciousness of the man-God in the 7th plane considers the consciousness of human beings as the most immature consciousness. Such is the vast difference in the factor of consciousness. Through unfailing, numerous reincarnations, wherein a limit to gross experiences is reached, and when the gross impressions become faint and almost defunct, the gross consciousness of conscious God in the man state gradually begins to involve, and God in the state of man is initiated into the process of involution of consciousness. At this stage, the involving gross consciousness experiences partially the first stage or plane of the subtle world through the medium of the already fully developed subtle body of God in the man state. This is the initial stage before the first plane, where the involved gross consciousness of gross conscious God in the man state obtains the first glimpses of the first plane of the subtle world. And experiences their impressions partially through the gross body and partially through the subtle body. Here, both the gross and the subtle senses are simultaneously used. This is the stage where God in the man state stands, as it were, on the line of demarcation, which delimits the gross world from the subtle world, and where the consciousness of God in the man state experiences strange things. With his gross eyes he obtains glimpses of the subtle plane. With his gross ears he hears celestial music of the subtle plane. With his gross nose he enjoys subtle scents. In short, gross conscious God in the man state, partially on the first plane of the subtle world, experiences subtle impressions with the gross senses. With further involution of gross conscious God gradually experiences completely the first plane of the subtle world. Now the gross consciousness of God in the man state is no longer gross conscious, but is subtle conscious. Subtle conscious God in the man state gradually becomes conscious of the second plane of the subtle world as the involution progresses on and on to enfold consciousness further and further. This subtle world is the domain of infinite energy. The infinite and unlimited power, which is an aspect of the infinite trio nature of God, when radiated from unbounded infinity into the finite worlds of illusion, is translated into the finite and manifested in the domain of the subtle world in the form of infinite energy of the subtle world. Thus, in the second plane, God in human form is subtle conscious, and therefore he is not conscious of the gross body and the mental body, the mind. But God in human form does work through the gross body and through the mind, parentheses, the mental body, close parentheses. Not directly, but on and from the subtle plane. Finishing at the top of page 116.